Good day, everyone. My name is Vince Cerf. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google and a member of the board of the Interplanetary Network Special Interest Group, now a chapter of the Internet Society. And as all of you are aware, we have these regular sessions to explore the implications of space travel and space technology, in particular, stimulated by our interest in the development and deployment of an interplanetary backbone network, which we variously call interplanetary internet or solar system internet or something along those lines. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, we are at a kind of, I would say, cusp in the story of space travel. It's shifting from the exploratory and scientific driver to an increasingly commercialized driver. We're seeing a little bit of that, certainly in near-Earth space with all of the satellite systems that are going up. Originally, it was telecom satellites, and it was surveillance satellites or satellites for environmental remote sensing. Now for communications, for example, the low Earth orbiting satellite systems of Starlink and Cooper and OneWeb and others. Small sats have become a part of the available resources. And there's energy behind the return to the moon, the Artemis mission, and associated Gateway mission, along with similar missions coming from ESA and JAXA and CARI, as well as NASA. So all of these things add up, in my view, to a time when serious thought about what it means to be operating in a commercial sense, in addition to operating in a more government-sponsored research sense in space, especially as we move away from Earth towards the moon and Mars and possibly other outer planets, the asteroids, and so on. And some of what has driven IPNSIG has been to understand that this potential for collaboration and interaction among the private sector with commercial interests and the government sector with research interests. And to be quite frank with you, another sector which is also nationally related, and that's military concerns. Space has become militarized, whether we like it or not. ASATs exist and have been demonstrated, and we are not going to, unfortunately, be able to undo any of that, which colors a lot of the thinking about what it means to operate in this environment, particularly as we start thinking about commercial activity. Now, the reason I emphasize the commercial activity in this introduction is that McKinsey, represented here by Ryan Burkhardt, has done a remarkable and focused study on the implications of commercialization of space. A lot of their focus has tended to be in the near-Earth environment, but their thinking through of the issues arising is very relevant to our own questions about what does it mean to have a mine on the moon? What does it mean to support communications with a mix of commercial and government and resources? How will we deal with jurisdictional questions? What happens if there are disputes? How do they get resolved? And although there are treaties that exist, like the 1967 Space Treaty, they don't really cover very much of that territory, because those treaties looked at outer space as if they were kind of like Antarctica, which should be sort of kept pristine and untouched. But that's not the likely outcome as we begin to see commercial interests. So the work and the report that the McKinsey has generated is extremely relevant to us and to others who have both an interest and an investment in this space. So Ryan, I'm going to ask you to take a moment to introduce yourself and your background and a little bit more about how this report even was undertaken. And then, to the extent that you can, give us the substance, important points that have arisen. But since we have only an hour, please give us some time towards the end of your presentation so that we can engage with the rest of the participants and get questions on the table. We're recording all of this, and I hope with your permission, we're going to share this with our members and frankly, the general public, so that if they couldn't join us today, they'll be able to learn from what you have to say. So with that long-winded introduction, I'm turning this over to Ryan to give us today's lessons.
Well, thank you very much, Vince, and good to be with all of you this afternoon. Just on behalf of the firm, it's been great to get to know you, Vince, and to have your wisdom and coaching as we've been through the process to develop this this paper. And of course, we're looking forward to engaging further with you and all of the the folks here on this topic. As you said, it's a very important topic. And will be being increasingly important as as space continues to become even more and more relevant in each one of our lives. So I think we all consider this in our working sessions with you and the rest of our advisory board. We always consider this to be the beginning of the discussion rather than the middle or the end. Maybe what I'll quickly do is spend 1 or 2 minutes here just introducing myself, and then I'll allow my colleague Brooke Stokes to introduce herself, and then we'll quickly get into the material here. I see that we already have some people on the chat, so we would love for this to be interactive, even in the upfront portion here. In that upfront portion, we'll go through kind of the highlights of the material. We won't take more than 20-ish or so minutes, to kind of do that. So we've got plenty of time for questions and further discussion at the end. So very quickly, my name is Ryan Brookhart. I'm a senior partner with McKinsey out of our Miami office. I started my career as an Air Force officer and spent 20 years through a mix of active and reserve duty, mostly in and around space and the nuclear parts of our Air Force. And most of my consulting work today is in aerospace defense and space. And space has become a very important topic for our firm as we've continued to invest in this area. And the partnership that we've had with the World Economic Forum, which we'll talk about in a moment, has been really instrumental for us to not only, of course, to work for our clients, but also to help all of us think through, what's the right thing to do for space for not just space purposes, but for kind of space for civilization. So maybe Brooke, quickly, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Looking forward to the dialogue. Brooke Stokes. I am a junior partner with McKinsey based out of Southern California in our aerospace and defense practice, focus on serving space and defense clients on strategy, go-to-market, scaling type topics, bringing a bit of a business and economic lens to the industry as it's at that point in its growth strategy. So with that, I think we go ahead and dive in.
Let's get into it. So like all good consultants, we have some pages. We're not going to drown you in them. There is a paper out there, which I think Vint referred to. And if you all don't have the link or the access to that, we'll make sure that goes out with the rest of the presentation here. The reason we're here is, basically about a year ago, this dialogue has been had kind of in pockets, and our aspiration was to really, come up with what we would call sort of a sharp perspective on, the current state of space activities globally, and really what that means in terms of aspirationally where we want to go as a civilization to the proper use of space. And then also make sure that, as Vince said, we're helping, the various regulatory bodies and governing bodies out there understand how they can help ensure that space remains open for access, open for business, but ensuring that there's appropriate governance around that. And it's always a balance, of course, between governance and innovation. But to do that and to kind of fulfill that aspiration of having something to say and to having a perspective around that, we partnered with the World Economic Forum, and we undertook about 6 to 7 months worth of effort. And this was not sort of just McKinsey, right? This was us working with a panel of about 12 to 13 advisors, of which Vint was one. And then we went out and talked to the broadest group of people we could think about, right? So we should talk to over 100 people globally, from Russia to Asia to Europe to the US to South America to the Middle East. We try to get as far and wide as we could We talked to folks that were in government, that were out of government, that were at private institutions, public institutions. We tried to get as broad of a sense as we could. It was really important to us that we did not focus in too narrowly on any one stakeholder's sort of perspective. And so we really tried to go pretty broad and deep. And if you move to the next page, what this kind of resulted in was us starting to think through how do we actually frame this up. And when we actually talk with non-space people just about how big the space economy is, for lack of a better term, 350 billion. I think later in the document we'll talk about, obviously folks know that that's going to grow. How fast and to what degree are a little bit of a question, but it's already large, right? And it's really growing, right? And there's a lot of exciting things that we all can see happening on a daily basis. One of the things is that while we all may know that it's large and growing and exciting, the relevance to other industries and to people in general may be a little bit less obvious. And so one of the things that we're going to do going forward is how do we translate all the excitement that's happening in this $350 billion space economy, and translate that into excitement amidst people in other sectors and other geographies, et cetera. But it is large and growing, which is pretty cool. And there's a lot of private investment coming into into this economy. Next slide. Maybe Brooke, I'll turn it over to you to kind of take us through some of the detail here.
That sounds great. So let's orient a bit on that existing market before we dive into the outlook for the future and what that may entail. So a lot of this growth is stemming both from advancements in technology performance as well as coming down the cost curve. And so what we outlined here was the increase over any given 10 to 15 year window from a cost performance perspective of technological disruptions. And I think it's quite astounding if you really look at the picture and digest it. When we think about some of the biggest innovations historically around Model T cars, televisions, internet access, things like that, several of them pale in comparison to the increase we've seen in satellite performance relative to costs. Really, the only close analog here is the revolution from mainframe to desktop computing. So just to orient and contextualize a bit, the incredible progress the industry has seen. That progress and the growth in the space economy has meant we've unlocked initial space-based applications across industries. So we certainly won't read you all the examples on this page, but there's a myriad of examples of ways in which space touches different industries, right? If you just look at some examples on here, the monitoring via satellites of methane emissions to allow energy and oil and gas companies to provide more transparency around emissions use. Or this group may be particularly interested in what you see under tech here, which is developing in-space computing offerings, technological development that is well underway. So across the gamut, touching everything from commodity traders to insurance companies, consumer, retail, you see the whole gamut. And our view is that this will only expand. I think the question is, how much will it expand and how quickly? A lot of the growth we expect in the space sector will be driven by application of space-based technology across industries and proliferation of those applications and use cases. What we did was we looked and saw the estimates out there publicly from various sources on growth in the space economy. You'll note that across them, the space economy is expected to see notable growth to 1 trillion plus in most cases. The real question is, how fast will that come about? There's estimates of anywhere from reaching that point 10 years from now to 20 plus years. And that remains to be proven. I think what is clear though right now is that we're at an inflection point in the sector. There's a lot of indicators, Vince spoke about these at the start, that get us quite excited about what's happening. You can see that active satellites have gone from about 1,000 10 years ago to nearly 5,000 now. We're launching at a cadence never before seen. Launch vehicle going up about once per week, if not more, as opposed to fewer than 100 total launches looking back 10 years. This is being fueled by increased investment in the sector. You see annual private funding was $1 billion 10 years ago. That is 12x larger as of 2021. Maybe one other one I'd highlight here is the countries with space agencies. I think Ryan and Vint both hit on this, but we're definitely seeing globalization of the activity going on in space. One of the questions this may raise for some of you all is that, haven't we been here before, and why is this different? In the 1990s, there was definitely enthusiasm about space and about potentially being on the brink of a hockey stick curve there as well. Many of those optimistic projections didn't play out as forecast. We dug in and think it's fundamentally different this time when you look at some of the core drivers. So we looked at 5 categories: technology, cost, applications, geopolitical dynamics, a couple others you'll see on the next slide. This slide speaks to tech and cost. You'll see satellite throughput, launch frequency, as I just spoke to, are significantly improved. This just enables a lot of opportunities that weren't possible before. We were talking about these applications and use cases. Could we from space monitor X or take pictures of Y and use it for various purposes? But oftentimes the resolution, the throughput, the revisit rates, various characteristics weren't where they needed to be to enable these applications. We're now at a different point from a tech perspective. I spoke earlier as well to coming down the cost curve. The cost of Earth observation imagery is materially smaller. Satellites, we were talking billion-dollar plus major satellite programs, often government programs like SBIRS. We've now continued to have those programs, but we also have the rise of smaller proliferated LEO constellations, which are oftentimes on the order of magnitude of 100K or hundreds of thousands of dollars per satellite. Launch costs also notably has come down due to a variety of drivers like launch cadence, reusability, improvements in manufacturing and supply chain. And then here's the other three factors I alluded to: the sources of capital, the applications, and the global competition. On the applications, we're now looking at space for space and space for Earth applications, ones with real potential business cases on the back end. And there's a lot more commercial activity, as been suggested at the start. 90% of satellites launched last year were for commercial use cases versus less than 50% a decade plus ago. On the sources of capital, I spoke to the private investor capital, but this global figure is also notable. We're now at nearly $100 billion in global spend on space versus $6 billion back in the 90s. And then the global dynamics, as you all no doubt are familiar, have certainly become more complicated and nuanced in today's environment with a variety of implications. Maybe with that, Ryan, I'll turn it over to you to talk about what that all means for the future.
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's one of the reasons we were excited to have Vince and frankly all of you talk with all of you today is because rightly or wrongly, I compare where we are with space to where we were with the internet, 20, 30-ish years ago, where lots of excitement, unclear how fast it'll grow and how responsibly it'll be used, maybe not full alignment around standards and norms and best practices and responsible use, et cetera. So that's kind of where we are today, where we have got a lot of excitement here and there's a lot of good that can be done. And frankly, there's a lot of questions, right, about what effective governance looks like. How do we, as I mentioned before, how do we make sure we have governance? But as Brooke talked about all of the great innovation that's gone on, how do we make sure we don't stifle that with too much? Who does that governance? How do we hold people accountable, right? So what we basically started with, and you can see on this page here, is we said, well, what are the ways that this new domain or this emerging domain, if you will, could play out? And obviously, the two axes that we used were kind of the value that could be generated, which is on the vertical there, and then the level, kind of the level of collaborative governance. And where we kind of have been is in number 4. It's largely been national security for national security's sake, right? And this all started right with the space race, right, between the USSR and the USA in many ways, and that drove. That competition drove many elements of our space economy, and for many years. Now I think we have a bit of a choice. Do we end up staying in that area? I think that ship is a bit sailed, but we could slip back into unrealized potential. Because we over constrict in terms of governance, or we're not aspirational enough into the things we could do. Maybe it's worse to move up into the upper left-hand corner, which is, we say domain of the Titans. That could be private individuals, or it could be a few countries. We have a few individuals on our advisory board from smaller countries or from smaller entities. And one of them, she said to us, we just don't want you guys to screw it up before we get a chance to get up there and really spend some time and be able to extract some value from it. So, we also don't want to end up in a situation where we allow only a few to thrive. And so, obviously, like any good consultant, you want to end up in the upper right-hand corner there. But what does that actually mean? And so, maybe Brooke, I'll if you go to the next slide, we sort of said, well, what would that look like? And this is sort of the 5 elements that we thought you would need to do in order to end up there. And I won't go through each one of these sort of in detail, but one of which is this whole idea of how can we use the economy to sense and communicate responsibly. And actually, you guys are working on this, right? I mean, we don't have standards for networking in space. Certainly not from a lunar perspective. So how do we do that in a way that allows us to bring the best of space to underserved populations in sub-Saharan Africa, for example? How do we use that economy to sort of do good, but do it in a responsible way? Another one that I might spend a little bit of time on is kind of discover and build, right? This is as Brooke said, maybe we're on the earlier phases. We're learning how to communicate. We're learning how to use remote sensing to do all those great use cases we talked about. But eventually, we're going to move to a space for space type economy where we're doing things in space that are building that infrastructure, and how do we actually bring some of that back down? So really using the microgravity environment for things that are space for space related, but also kind of space for ground. And I would tell you that we're only touching the surface there. There's ideas, but none of them have been really fully explored, and it's been too expensive to experiment. We're getting to the point where that won't be the case, sort of going forward. Sustain and manage. And this is another one, right? We have to build infrastructure up there, right? If we're going to have this, sustain itself. And that means everything from communications infrastructure to, fueling to other types of services. Certainly, if humans are going to be there, we have to be able to, water and breathable air and these types of things. How do we build the infrastructure, to be able to do that? And obviously, again, I know nothing about the internet compared to Vint, but at some point we had to build that for the internet. We had to build, the server network and the communications nodes. We had to lay fiber. We had to do all these types of things. Very little of that has been done in space today. But again, we're getting to that point, given those technological investments that Brooke talked about, where there is a business case to be made for companies to actually go and do that, because there is a benefit that could be provided to either people in space or people, sort of on the ground. So when we think about how do we end up in that upper right-hand corner, these are just some of the elements that were really important to us. Next slide. And then we only got a couple of slides left here, and we'll open it up for some questions. So how do we do this? How do we get to that thriving, sort of space economy, space environment? By the way, we often struggle. We call it an economy. I'm not sure even that's the right word. We say environment. I mean, there's all these different ways to describe it. We don't want to be too commercial because of all the non-commercial uses for it. But how do we actually get to that self-sustaining, sort of economy? And these were kind of the 5 elements. And we debated these pretty heavily with our advisory group and got a lot of input from those folks that I mentioned. I'll highlight three of them, but just if you take a quick read through here, we need to have effective space governance. We talked a little bit about that. We need to actually invest. The role of government and the role of private industry, there's still hard problems to solve, right? And I think we need to focus on getting the cost down or developing the technology and what those hard problems are. How do we incentivize collaboration? This is impossible task number one in many ways, right? We already know we're at a global, a lot of global issues that are happening out there today. Vint talked a little bit about some of the irresponsible behavior that we've already seen. But what are the mechanisms that we use? And we thought a lot about what are the analogs here? How do we do air traffic control globally? How do we manage sea lanes and our oceans globally? How did those systems develop, and what can we learn from those? The next one is kind of fostering a self-sustaining industrial base, right? It's really, government has kind of kept things afloat for the last 50, 60 years of the space program in many ways. How do we actually flip that a little bit so that it's your private industry, private capital, and really global in nature? How do we foster that so that, again, we don't end up in that domain of the Titans? We want to make sure that there's industrial base globally. We want to make sure that that's a multifaceted set of investors that are functioning there. And then the last one is, sort of how do we use this industry to advance sustainability and security, right? We've already seen a lot of the security aspects of what space can do based on the conflict in Ukraine. We've seen companies like Maxar and Planet, hold certain folks to account because we can now take imagery immediately, or we can use other sensing devices to get information about what's actually happening there. How that will end up being used long term, I don't know, but certainly near term, it has allowed the public, you and me, to be able to go online and understand a bit more about what's happening there versus what we might have gotten even a few years ago. When you can image the Earth every day, or you can image the Earth in multiple phenomenologies at night when it's raining or through the clouds, those types of things will be very powerful. Sustainability is another one. We're just starting to scratch the surface about how we actually promote many of the sustainability initiatives that are out there, whether it's holding people accountable or frankly looking for other opportunities. I mean, how do we get more out of our crops? Right, food security is obviously a huge issue right now, given what we're seeing in Ukraine and what could emerge in some in other geographies. So getting productivity out of our agriculture is super important, as well as things like monitoring canopy throughout the Earth, monitoring our coral reefs, etc. So these are kind of the five things, and this is the start of a dialogue, folks, because if we had all the answers to these, we'd be done. But we're not. And so I think I'll dive into a couple of these, and I know I'm getting a little long-winded here, so maybe I'll flip through these next quickly because I'm sure I made some of the points. I think I talked about a bunch of stuff here. I think somebody's putting debris in the chat. We can talk about that more. Clearly, that's a huge issue, and you'll see it in a number of the discussions, sort of that we've had. And I would say that people know about debris, at least here around the globe in the space community, right? The space community has thought about that. Other people in other communities have not, right? I'm not sure this is yet the urgency of that and the concern around that has risen to the level that we need it to amongst non-space, both executives as well as folks in government and many of our governing bodies throughout the world. So we need to raise the profile there. But how about space traffic management at the Lagrange points? That's gonna be a thing, right? And right now there's nothing. It's the wild, wild west out there. So how long do we wait for that? How urgent is that? I think we can debate, but certainly there's a lot of other elements here which you can see. Many of these are not even being regularly discussed in the space community. Next slide. We talked a little bit about enabling resources, and I mentioned some of these. Certainly, down mass is really important as an example, right? To some of the experimentation we might want to do for pharmaceuticals or material science, et cetera, be able to bring those things down. There's been some of that. Thinking about how do we continue to come down the cost curve, whether that's advanced propulsion or whether it's component, improvements and miniaturization. How do we continue down that? Because the cheaper it is to get there, the cheaper it is to do things, the cheaper it is to handle data, the more applications and business cases that begin to close. How do we get the right, cyber secure type environment? We already know there's bad actors out there, but obviously many of the applications that we see, whether it's imagery, whether it's various types of remote sensing, whether it's communications in general, that breaks down if we can't do so in a secure way. And we're already seeing, as many of you have seen in the press, obviously, Starlink went out very quickly after the initial events in Ukraine and deployed terminals. Now we're seeing bad actors go after those Starlink terminals, and we're seeing increased cyber attacks here. So how do we continue to ensure that we have a safe environment and a secure environment? And these are hard problems, right, that are not yet solved. Next and last slide, I think. How do we get this this sort of self-sustaining industrial base, right? And this was we had some great folks on our board. We had Will Marshall from Planet, we had Chris Kemp from Astra, as two examples of folks that are at the bleeding edge of innovation. And their big concern was, well, how do we make sure that we're able to innovate responsibly, but still be able to get the private capital we need to take some risks, right? And so these were some of the things that we a little bit talked about. How do we get government to signal their support, to take some risk on some of these commercial technologies, to buy them, et cetera? How do we speed that investment, if you will? How do we increase the dialogue down in the lower left hand around space and non-space and the end users? This is going to be one of the big priorities for us as a group going forward, is raising the awareness of what space can do for you. I mean, there are folks out there that say, why do we need GPS satellites out there? I have GPS on my phone. I don't know if you guys know this, but without the satellite parts, it doesn't work, right? So we're at the level of and by the way, we need to understand their problems. What are the mining companies' biggest problems as they work towards a sustainable future, but also deliver the lithium that we need in order to build batteries, right? So there's a lot of challenges. How do we understand what that industry's problems are so we can figure out what role space may play in that? Moving barriers to competition, not putting up artificial barriers, by the way, country by country, to stifling innovation. This is also really important. And then I think, like I said, on the space decision makers, I mean, we have some great bodies that are out there. I think everybody saw our vice president here in the United States talking in advance of the Space Council meeting here in a few weeks out in California the other day. It's that kind of engagement with senior leaders that's really going to help us turn the corner on this. But getting them educated and helping them understand how they can help in the space ecosystem is a priority issue. So I think with that, I think I'll sort of, I think that's it, Brooke, if I'm not mistaken. So hopefully, Vint, I hit most of the relevant points. We hit most of them. Obviously, the big report is out there, but a very exciting area, and we'd be happy to engage in some questions here. That's helpful.
Well, it's an astonishing amount of material to cover in such a short amount of time. But then I would
sorry.
Well, and first of all, that's what McKinsey is known for, right? Cover a lot of territory in a short amount of time. But the whole topic, of course, is as big as outer space. There already are a few questions, and let's get to those right away. The first one, Patrick Ryan asked about the debris problem, and he uses this wonderful economic term. It's negative externality. This is how economists dismiss a lot of problems that the engineers are saying need to be attended to. So this is an interesting question about, he's asking, well, how would you deal with that? Mandatory insurance to deal with damage, and the cost of deorbiting. What other ways could we incite or incent good stewardship? Do we need regulatory enforcement to achieve that, or some other means of encouragement? So how do we clean up our act, basically, and what forcing functions and incentives might there be to do that?
Yeah, let me start off on that one. I mean, great question, Patrick. And across the 100 or so interviews we did, I doubt there was more than a handful in which debris wasn't raised as just one of the things that's necessary for everyone to pay attention to and honestly come together to solve for the benefit of everyone. But that's much easier said than done. I don't think we left this work with the perfect answer on what's the right policy, but what we did do was hear a lot of good ideas, and some combination of them is probably what the right group needs to work through going forward. And so the way I would think about it is there's really two things that need to be solved. One is the existing debris and how to remove that. And the second is how to prevent further buildup of debris. And different levers you can pull for each of them. The one you talk about mandatory insurance or requiring, along with a launch license, you've got to carry the right insurance to account for deorbiting and debris removal, and perhaps cover it both for your satellite, but also cover some of the costs of a more large-scale remediation effort to cover that existing debris was one of the ideas. There's been a host of others, everything from a one-up, one-down policy, which comes with nuances around ownership of existing debris up there, things like that. Everything from that to really investing in satellite servicing solutions so that we can extend the lifetime of satellites, get more out of them, and limit debris that way, to requiring propulsion on satellites to enable more collision avoidance maneuvers, to again limit potential debris, perhaps linking insurance costs to the probability of collision, and incenting properly through that. I could go on and on. There's been a host of these different things, but it's probably some combination of those that's going to require standard setting and alignment, probably at different levels. Like with other domains, like take air traffic control or something else, where not every nation was on board at the start, but you grew buy-in over time. That's probably how something like this needs to work.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Brooke, because that's what I was going to say is that, one of the big debates that we had is on any of the policy type issues, do we try to get a bunch of nations together in one of the various fora to agree on something, or does one or more countries or small groups of countries, the US or Europe or something like that, do they need to lean forward on this and become the standard? And I think we heard kind of debates on both sides. To be honest, I think where we heard more of, or where we may end up, is somebody has to take the lead here and has to say, this is the standard. If the United States were to come forward and say, look, this is what we're going to do in the United States. We're going to have a one up, one down policy. We're only going to allow a license with these types of provisions, and if you don't do it, we're not going to give you the next license, or, what have you. If a nation or a small set of nations doesn't do that and set the example, and then contrast that against the inappropriate or the less desirable behavior, it may not happen, because trying to get everybody together, all the spacefaring nations, however many countries there are now, I think it's like 100 that have space agencies on board, probably won't happen. And as you guys know standards certainly better than I do, but standards don't come from the government, right? They come from private industry. They come from groups of individuals coming together, and then government basically validating it later. And that's probably what needs to happen here to some degree as well, is that there needs to be someone to step out first and to say, this is what we're going to do. And there are groups that are doing that, I think, that are thinking about what are the standards for interfaces on deorbit? What are, how would that work? How can we all kind of do the same thing? So.
Well, thank you both for those answers. Several things immediately occur to me. One of them is that there are other kinds of debris to be worried about, not just the things that are in orbit, but when we get back to the moon and we have a mine on the moon, what do we do with the stuff that we bring there? What kind of pollution might we be introducing? The scientists are worried that we'll mess up our opportunity to understand how life got formed because we brought it with us and then discovered it. It's sort of like Pogo. We discovered the enemy and it's us. So there are all kinds of questions about that. One possibility is that because most of the countries don't have lift capacity and they're going to have to turn to commercial sources to do that, which is quite exciting. I mean, the recent launches of the SpaceX spacecraft on behalf of other countries who are putting up their assets might mean that the lift-capable companies will have to require certain things of the customer if there's global agreement on, for example, deorbiting plans and the ability to maneuver and several other things that might be imposed on the parties that are providing the lift capability, or you can't get on board. There are a bunch of other questions here, so let's keep going. Some of them are in the Q&A, and I would suggest that we move questions there for those of you who are entering questions rather than splitting them between the chat and the Q&A. But in the Q&A, Jorge Amodio asks, what kinds of regulations do you expect to keep the space economy open and under control, and who would execute those or enforce those regulations? That's a pretty hard question, I think.
Yeah, it's a bit the million-dollar question there, and I do think, Jorge, you might have put that one in before Ryan spoke to some of that. So I think the slide he talked to around where you saw the Lagrange points and property and usage rights, all of that, attempted to summarize the key areas we think regulation is most needed, in the sense that commercialization is really outpacing governance. And so I think that is around the property access ownership rights, right? As nations race to the moon and various critical points, what does ownership look like? What do property rights really mean? That's going to be a key area. Maintaining responsible behaviors in space. So as we just spoke about with debris, and to Ryan's anecdote on smaller countries sort of saying, wait, make sure you don't ruin it for the rest of us. That's going to be critical. The standards Ryan's talked to a few times. And as we think about internet for space, the interfaces of docking adapters as we get more space stations up there, all sorts of things, that's going to be key. And then how do we ensure safety as you've got more humans traveling to space, living, working there? How do we go about ensuring safety so that we don't hit a real cliff on this progress? And the answer of who needs to do it, I think, it varies across different areas. So one of the efforts we're engaged in now is trying to more activity by activity map what the existing governance looks like. Who's involved globally, regionally, nationally, across different types of activities, everything from recommendations to policymaking to enforcement, and learning from analogs. I don't think any example is perfect, right? You hear about air traffic control, you hear about maritime, you hear about Antarctica Treaty, all sorts of examples. None of them are perfect. For instance, space traffic management is not just like air traffic control, because ICAO really focuses on civil aviation. For space, it's pretty dual use, inextricably linked there, and that has its own ramifications on what's possible. So I think you can pull some of the best from other things, but won't directly apply. I think macro-wise, it's what Ryan talked to, which is we're going to have to start smaller scale and build from there, get consensus, and buy-in from a few nations, a few commercial parties that are meaningful, and build on top of that. But no one perfect answer, I think.
Well,
Ryan, of course, feel free to add.
Ben, go ahead.
I think we are absolutely going to learn a lot. Mistakes will be made, and we will hopefully learn from them. The law of the sea, which, as you remember, took 20 years to get to, and the U.S. has not yet signed, does have a lot of provisions in it, especially salvage, for example, and in terms of safety at sea, it's an obligation to respond to emergencies. So we would hope, for example, that all those signing up for the Artemis return to the moon missions would agree that in the event of an accident or a life-threatening situation, that all parties who are capable of assisting would be committed to doing so. Those are the kinds of either norms that we would want to adopt, or maybe even formal policies. There is a very interesting question about pollution and how to cope with it, because the various activities now contemplated on the moon are quite different from the ones that we chose to avoid in Antarctica. We don't do mining in Antarctica, but there is a real serious consideration for mining on the moon, or finding water in the South Pole, for example, which would be very helpful either for oxygen and fuel or for just ordinary living. So let's keep going. Ryan has another question about the total addressable market and your calculations associated with it. He says, how do you take into account the closed nature of the industry? There's hardly any non-US person that works in space, and funding from government is really restrictive. So isn't the total addressable market dependent on US government funding? I'm going to inject a personal response to that. The answer is no. And the reason is that the lift capabilities now offered by companies, especially like SpaceX and Blue Origin, are largely available to any country that wishes to and can afford to pay for it, and the costs are coming down. There may still be some concerns about providing service to some countries who are considered pariah. Maybe North Korea would be an example of that. But for the most part, I think the addressable market will be increasingly addressable by the private sector. But Brooke and Ryan, what are your views on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, Vin. I mean, I do agree with what Patrick says, though. You know, it is hard for a U.S. person or a non-U.S. person to really get involved in the core of many aspects of U.S. space, right? It's just and it is the largest, you know, at the moment, the largest contributor, you know, to that space economy number. The one thing I would say, though, and Brooke can probably talk to more of the specifics, but if we were to re-put that chart back up, which we don't need to do, but the space services aspect is really, it's the people that are benefiting from it that end up, you know, that's really the addressable market, right? I mean, yes, Elon Musk, there's part of the market that's paying him for the actual launch services, but I think our view is that even today, it's the value-added services, whether it's, you know, direct TV, whether it's communications in space, whether it's, you know, these other types of applications, the beneficiary applications of GPS, et cetera. I mean, at the end of the day, those are all quote unquote part of the total, you know, sort of addressable market. You know, some things may always be free, like weather. I don't know, maybe they won't. You know, or the U.S. government just pays for it. I would even tell you that there are companies that are out there that believe there's a market for someone to pay for certain aspects of weather, which again has always been sort of free. So I in some ways it is somewhat still true that the U.S. drives a lot of the TAM in many ways. The U.S. government pays a lot of money into there, and everybody wants into that part of the market. But I think our view is that the other parts of the market still will continue to grow and probably outpace the investment there.
So our chairman, Yosuke Kaneko, asks, based on your views, in order to effectively reach the free and open self-sustaining model in the upper right, what are the core issues that we face today? What are some of the governance frameworks that we need to add or reform in order to achieve a healthy governance regime?
I'm going to answer that question orthogonally, which is, I think we talked about many of the issues that need to be solved. I think you can really distill it down into two core problems, right? One of which is speed. We're not moving nearly quickly enough on the regulatory and governance piece than we are on technology and use and these other types of things, and we really risk ending up in sort of a wild west scenario if we can't have the speed of some of those things catch up. I think the second one is really, you know, geopolitics and global collaboration. I mean, you know, space is the same as every other you know, environment out there, whether it's how we think about technology stacks in certain parts of the world versus other parts of the world, where we just think about, you know, how we navigate air traffic over certain parts of the world versus other parts of the world. You know, and unfortunately, the core problem there is, you know, we're going to have very distinctly different incentives around geopolitics. Some of them will result in actually increased space activity. I mean, there will probably be a competition between the U.S. and China in terms of the moon. I think it's already underway. So that's a core problem. So what do you do about that, right? I mean, I think, you know, you do what you can, right? It was just, how do we, I won't repeat everything we've talked about, but, you know, those that want to act responsibly and are in space today need to lead. They need to move quickly and need to set the example. They need to set the governance, and they need to lead. And if they don't, I think that's the real risk that we see.
Well, two things immediately strike me. The first one is that for air traffic control, I mean, very quickly after airplanes became a viable thing for either cargo delivery or mail delivery or people, we evolved a set of procedures that were agreed by nations since we all share this common airspace, and we have national boundaries for airspace, but we needed to have agreed procedures for allowing aircraft to enter and leave and land and so on. And so that's been fairly well worked out. Jorge asks whether the Artemis Accords are a step in a good direction, and my naive answer is yes, I believe so. But I see you're nodding as well, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm a business consultant, not a policy expert, certainly, but I think I would agree with that, Vint. I mean, look, there are a set of accords that are clear, they're understandable, they're easy to follow. They will have real impact on those that sign up to it. And so I think, yes, I think they're a step in the right direction. And like we talked about it, at some point it has to be the coalition of the willing and the available versus everybody. And, I think to Vince's point, there's some urgency here on getting something out there. So I definitely think, are they completely exhaustive? Do they solve everything? No, but, when's the last time we did anything meaningful on that dimension? The Outer Space Treaty is 1 million years ago, right? And some of these other things are just incredible, a long time ago. So I do think it's a step in the right direction.
So Oscar Garcia, who runs our projects working group at IPNSIG, says that his company is in the medical records for space business. And he's asking, what's the possibility of space exploration where people who are living in space need to consult for medical purposes with their doctors on Earth? Talk about remote medicine. This is very remote medicine, but it's going to be important because there may not be very many doctors in space. So if you need help, you may need to call home.
Well, I think the short answer is we're already doing that. I mean, I had an opportunity to spend some time with the Inspiration 4 crew a few weeks ago, and they did this, right? They needed to contact medical professionals on the ground. This happens on the ISS routinely, where someone gets ill, and so I think people are going to get sick up there, right? Certainly as more people go up there. And by the way, the other thing is that, as you all know, with the democratization of getting into space, it's not just the young and healthy and resilient that are now going up into space. I mean, William Shatner went up in June last year, I think it was, whenever that was. He was 90 years old, right? And so there are going to be people up there that either want to go up there or we need to have up there for various reasons that are not the Mercury 7 or whatever. So I definitely think that, and then long duration is another thing, right? I mean, I think comparatively we've done short duration. But I think the medical community is going to be super important in terms of, and that real-time feedback and, et cetera, is going to be critical in us being able to live and operate in space. Absolutely.
So a very critical question that Ahmed Matawi asks is, what's the future of this industry if many countries insist on making this a challenged space, a militarily challenged space? Are we at odds, and can we still make this work as close to the upper right-hand quadrant as possible, even though the militarization is apparently inescapable?
Well, I think we can. I think, but to the point, look, having the military and national security interests of various nations work alongside commercial interests, that has been the way space has been for many years. The question is, will one crowd out the other? I think what I hope is that the commercial benefits of space to any country are massive, right? In addition to the military benefits, the same as you could say for air traffic or for sea traffic or for the cyberspace, whatever word you want to use. And so the idea that any nation would destroy their own access to those to that domain would be self-defeating. You would hope, right? I mean, of course, there are crazy people out there, but with the increased actually commercialization of space, I would think that actually in some way acts as a deterrent. Now, of course, every week something goes by where we're moving satellites closer and closer to others and doing dangerous things and all kinds of bad behavior. The question is, can we keep those separate? I think the moon is going to be the next test bed, right? And with the the U.S. government and the Chinese government in particular looking at landing assets and people, and as Brooke talked about, what are the property rights and what are the norms of behavior, if we don't have property rights, obviously, but what are the norms of behavior that those two nations in particular are going to come against, are going to be the next critical point. So I think the industry, the future is good. I think the outlook it has a good potential. It can obviously be taken awry, but those commercial interests are pretty strong.
So we need to wrap up here. One observation is that 22 countries have signed the Artemis Accords. That's certainly encouraging, or institutions anyway. Second, there's the observation that there's other space agencies that are involving provision of lift capability, with Ariane from ESA, for example, and Rocket Lab from New Zealand. And last question from Oscar Garcia is whether the speakers, Ryan and Brooke, are willing to share their email addresses with the IPNSIG attendees and to continue conversation. Will that be feasible?
Absolutely. I think Brooke's putting it in the chat right now. I mean, we don't have all the answers. And so I think we would love, any feedback that you have. We'd love to engage with you on this or other topics. I mean, what we've told all the folks we've interacted with, this is a dialogue that we're trying to promote, not answer. And so thank you so much for your questions. And Vint, thank you for hosting us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank
Thanks,
you
everyone.
for so timely. Thank you so much, Brooke and Ryan. Thank you, all the participants. We're looking forward to following this up, and as they say, to be continued.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, see you on the net. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.